So, without further ado, the moment you've been waiting for, please join me in welcoming the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
This August in Chicago.
Hey, everybody.
Vice President Kamala Harris addressed a crowd of around 2,000 people, a group of mostly Democratic activists focused on the issue of gun control.
As Vice President of the United States, I am acutely aware of the fact that gun violence is the leading cause of death of the children of America. It's
the kind of event she's doing more of in the lead up to 2024, as she plays a key role in the Biden campaign's efforts to win over a skeptical base. And afterward, she sat down with me.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Doing well.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking some time out.
Wow. We're like on a talk show.
By the time of this interview in Chicago, I had been reporting on Harris for 5 months as part of a writing project I took on at the beginning of the year. An 8,000-word profile of the vice president for the New York Times Magazine. And over the course of that reporting, I learned a lot about Kamala Harris's life and historic career. From community classes she took growing up in Oakland, designed to instill pride in local Black children, to her time as a prosecutor in California, to the inside workings of her presidential campaign and her current role as vice president. The assignment was wide-ranging, and that was by design. Because ever since I first started covering Harris, back when she was running for president in 2019, the sentiment I have heard the most from voters, Democratic operatives, and even some of her fans is that they don't really feel like they know her or have a sense of what type of president she'd be. In fact, the first story I ever wrote about Harris, in January of that year, was about that very thing, and I continued to ask these questions throughout her presidential campaign, which sometimes frustrated the candidate and her team. And now, nearly 4 years later, many of these same questions have taken on a renewed importance, not only because of the central role Harris has in the campaign, but because of voter concerns about Biden's advanced age, which has led some Republicans to argue explicitly that a vote for President Biden is really a vote for President Harris. And so, before I asked Harris about 2024, I wanted to ask her once again about herself, who she is, where she comes from, and most importantly, what she stands for. From the New York Times, I'm Astead Herndon. This is The Run-Up. I appreciate you taking some time out. The last time we sat down was in September 2019, I think. You were in the middle of the presidential race. A lot has happened since then. We've had a pandemic. We've had a movement for racial justice. You've broken another barrier in the process. I guess my first question is just expectations to reality. Like, how is the job? And do you like being vice president?
I love my job because of moments like this, not this interview, but just, don't be confused. But because of moments like why we're here in Chicago today, right? 2,000 leaders, many are mothers who lost a child to gun violence. Many are students who have been traumatized by the fear of gun violence. And being able to lend my voice as Vice President of the United States to support their movement for reasonable gun safety laws. There are certain opportunities that come only with a position like being Vice President of the United States to uplift the voices of the people in a way that I think matters and makes a difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up when you talk to people who have known you for a long time is really how California is a defining part of that experience and how it shapes you.
True.
How would you describe that kind of early life in Berkeley and how that kind of shapes the politician we see right now?
Well, you've heard me say this, but I literally grew up with the adults around me marching and shouting for justice. And I grew up in an environment that was rich with activism and optimism. I grew up when Aretha Franklin was telling me I was young, gifted, and black. I grew up in a moment, and obviously not directly, but in terms of her song, I grew up in a moment where there was an incredible amount of pride in community, but also coalition. And it was not just happening, people talked about it, right? It was very purposeful and very intentional. I grew up in an environment where, children were nurtured in a very substantial way to be and to do and to challenge the things around them and to challenge status quo. And all of that, I know, in my formative years, really influenced the person that I would become as an adult, to have that sense of possibility and to understand what can be unburdened by what has been.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that comes up in that, I think about Rainbow Sign, or I heard about the cactus classes on Sundays.
Oh, yes, you did?
Yeah.
Wow.
I feel like that's a real specific Black resilience that comes through there.
Yes.
How specifically, and also feels like it sticks out that there's a real absence of whiteness, too, in that kind of growing up and shaping. How is that kind of racial politics of the Bay or Berkeley at that time, specifically?
Well, you're wrong, though, but you're wrong. As I said earlier, it really was about community and coalition. And so there is no question that there was a lot that was happening around, some would call it the Black Power movement, but around an understanding and appreciation for culture and for history in terms of Black history, Black culture. But, there was also happening then a thriving Chicano movement. There was also happening a thriving Asian community and movement, and not to mention, there were so many who were part of that whole movement that were Jewish, for example. So it was not one thing to the exclusion of the other. And I think that the mistake that anyone makes is to think that, it's a zero-sum game and that if you are proud of and focused on one thing, it's to the exclusion of anything else, because it was not. It was actually quite inclusive.
Kind of cross-coalition building.
Yeah, yeah.
With that in mind, I can see how that influences the decision to go to Howard. I heard some people describe it as not as someone trying to kind of find their space in Blackness, but someone who was really comfortable in those spaces already. Is that the right way to think about it?
Absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I had family members who went to Howard, and they would talk about Howard. My auntie Chris went to Howard and pledged AKA, and in many ways, I really loved and admired her, and in many ways wanted to emulate her.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that sticks out about Howard or Berkeley is it also produces kind of radical politics, people who are trying to upend systems often. It seems like you made the kind of conscious choice early to be someone who wants to work within the system to find change. How did you just see that as your role? And specifically, how did you come to the decision as a prosecutor to make change happen? I'm
going to challenge your definition of radical.
Okay.
Radical, from my perspective, has often been a word used with people who understand that the system and the status quo can and must be changed. And in that way, understand that, for example, as I did, that to become a prosecutor was to go inside of the system and attempt to improve it from inside. Some would call that a radical approach to tradition, which is to say that tradition we should challenge whether traditional approaches have actually been effective in achieving the intended goal, which in this case is community safety.
Mm-hmm. You saw going into that office as a prosecutor as a radical choice.
I didn't use the term radical, but I certainly understood that it was a very conscious decision. There's no question about that, and I made it for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, to be candid, I don't talk about it very often, is one of my best friends in high school, I learned, was being molested by her stepfather. And when I realized that was happening, I said to her, "You got to come live with us." I called my mother and I said, "Mommy, this is how." She said, "Yes, she needs to come live with us." And she did. And a lot of that experience and seeing what that was for her, and coupled with, I guess, a very real instinct of mine always, which has been to try to protect people. I also became a prosecutor and specialized in crimes against women and children, and I specialized for a long time in child sexual assault cases for that reason. So there were many reasons that I chose to become a prosecutor, and including challenging the notion that you can't work to change systems from the inside. There's an approach that I have always taken. I said it here in Chicago. There's the inside-outside game. And there's a role for everyone everywhere. I will tell you this, and maybe it's a radical notion. I have never believed that I don't belong somewhere. And I was raised to believe that I belong anywhere that I choose to go. And so that might be a radical notion, especially given,
Where does that kind of self-confidence even early come from?
My community, my family, everything, every kind of message that I received, especially growing up, was you can be and do anything.
I guess kind of just to make the point clear, though, why not a public defender? Why not other ways to use legal advocacy?
I believed that there should be, that we who believe that change and reform should happen have to be inside as well as on the outside. I felt very strongly about that.
In California...
Because here's the thing.
Go ahead.
Being on the inside, you don't have to ask anybody permission. I didn't have to ask anybody permission when I created one of the first reentry initiatives in the United States and said, I'm going to focus on first-time, low-level drug sales offenders and get them jobs and counseling. And if they are a parent, parenting classes. I didn't have to ask anybody permission.
You know,
sometimes I'm not so good asking for permission.
In California, there's often the distinction not between DNR, but just between Democrats themselves. We use terms like liberal, progressive, all of those things. When you were coming up kind of in that world of California politics, how did you see yourself? How did you kind of define your own politics?
I think it depends on who you're talking to in terms of how they use the word. So I have... why don't you define each one for me, and then I can tell you where I fit. If you want to say, for example, that believing that working people should receive a fair wage and be treated with dignity and that there is dignity in all work, well, then I don't know what label do you give that one. If you believe that that parents should have affordable child care, I'm not sure what the label is for that. If you believe that, as we have just accomplished, seniors should be able to not have to go into medical debt to fill a prescription for insulin, and it should be capped at $35 a month, I don't know what that label is. If you believe that we need to focus on an issue like maternal mortality and recognize how race and socioeconomic status can play a role in that, what's that label, right?
I guess often the label's used as kind of proxies for kind of root cause conversations. Maybe progressives believe that, kind of structural inequality is such that it has to be upended. Liberals are thinking more about working within system or something like that. I'm saying when you think about kind of the root cause of why issues are the way that they are, what do you point back to?
Well, name the issue and then I'll tell you. There's no monolith. Name the issue.
Inequality.
What kind of economic inequality? Well, then you'd have to look at, for example, a variety of issues. You can look at, let's just take the African-American experience from slavery on. And we don't have to even go back that far to understand where the inequality came from. There were no 40 acres and a mule, by the way. You look at redlining. You look at what happened in terms of, for example, the Tulsa riots. You look at Black Wall Street. You look at what happened in terms of the GI Bill, when there was a boost by the federal government to invest in mostly men, but returning from battle, from war, and an intent to build a middle class around those extraordinary people who sacrificed so much, and how Black folks were excluded. So, economic inequality there? Well, there were issues that were about policy and practice that excluded purposely people based on their race.
But one of the quotes I most remember from your presidential run was you saying, when asked what you believe in, that you weren't trying to restructure society. How do you solve those kind of deep systemic inequalities that you're laying out without restructure? See what I'm saying?
Well, I think you have to be more specific because I'm not really into labels in terms of that kind of approach. I think that, okay, so let's break down. Let's actually deconstruct the points you're making. What do we need to do to address something like economic inequality in terms of access to capital? Okay, that's a big issue. If you come from a community that does not have, for a variety of reasons that we again just spoke of one, that does not have intergenerational wealth, but you are someone who is an entrepreneur and has a really good idea but no access to capital, right? But your idea is great, and you are hardworking and you have a good plan. The work that I have been doing for many years is increasing access to capital for women and minority and rural businesses, understanding that they're not going to get the kind of opportunity from a big bank because the big bank doesn't necessarily understand the mores or the capacity or the needs or dreams of a community to invest in a small business in that community. So there are specific ways that we go about doing it.
I got you. I guess one of the ways I want to sit with this kind of question is in criminal justice, where you spent a lot of your career. I reread Smart on Crime a couple months ago. How would you kind of define that? It was a phrase really associated with your rise and kind of associated with your brand of how you view criminal justice. What does Smart on Crime mean?
I came up with the phrase.
What does Smart on Crime mean?
It means I proposed it by saying that for too long on criminal justice policy, we've offered a false choice, which suggests you're either soft on crime or you're tough on crime. And instead, I proposed we should ask, are we smart on crime? And in asking that question, measure our effectiveness similar to how the private sector, for example, does. The private sector will often be quite unburdened by ideology when asking of its productivity, what is the return on the investment, right? ROI. So the Smart on Crime philosophy was about, let's ask, what is the return on our investment? We're putting extraordinary amounts of money into a criminal justice system that is mostly focused on reaction and not prevention. But empirical evidence and anecdotal evidence, for sure, tells us that it's actually a greater return on our investment to focus on prevention instead of reaction, focusing on what we need to do around workforce development, mental health treatment, supporting working families versus anywhere from $35,000 to $100 and something thousand a year to incarcerate someone, right? So that's what the Smart on Crime philosophy is about.
When you think about when you wrote that and kind of branded that versus how we talk about criminal justice now, it does seem a little different, both in terms of policies that you've come around to embrace.
It was almost 20 years ago.
Certainly.
Very different.
I guess I'm
Very
asking,
different.
when you look back at that, do you see the kind of updated, your kind of updated policy beliefs, or the updated way you talk about it as just an evolution based on new evidence? Or is that a kind of tacit admission that the view of which, you were coming to it 20 years ago might have been incorrect?
Well, there are many chapters in the book which outline different areas of the criminal justice system. So why don't we break it down to which part you're talking about, and then I can tell you.
Well, I think about kind of cash bail, the need to keep bail at a certain level because it deters crime. That seems to be an idea that's out of favor both with you and the Democratic Party at large right now. Should we take that as a new updated evidence, or should we take that as maybe 20 years ago we weren't on the right track?
I think it depends on what kind of crime you're talking about, to be honest.
Okay. When you think about what changed from then to now, is there anything you look back and say, I wish we did differently?
You have to be more specific.
As a prosecutor, I'm thinking through the lens of trying to create justice, which I feel like you have outlined as the reason you got in that role.
And to create justice in the criminal justice system, for me, it included how to achieve a goal that we all have, which is to allow people to be safe, right? And be free from fear. Yeah.
When you look back at the policies, both as AG and DA, do you see policies like the truancy program as something that lines up with that belief, in retrospect? Well,
here's the thing about, I maintain a very, in fact, I talked about it out here, a very strong feeling that we have to focus on the needs of families to support them in raising their children. Mm-hmm. And we have to, on policy that is focused on children, that we should not, I believe, be paternalistic in the way we approach policy that affects children, meaning to assume, because there's a lot of public policy over the years that has done this, to assume that the parents don't love their children or don't care about their children as much as other parents, when in fact the issue is they simply may not have the resources to do the things that need to happen to fully take care of that child. Mm-hmm. And I maintain that is true. So, for example, the work that we have done and I have advocated for years around affordable child care. The president and I are proposing that people shouldn't, under certain income, should not pay more than 7% of their income in child care. Because the reality is that if they can't afford to go to work and to send their children to daycare, the quality of their life overall and the projections for the future of that child's life are much lower than had they the ability to afford childcare and be able to go to work. Mm-hmm. So this is the connection between these issues, and I think that when we judge public policy, we should always think about the actual effect and impact on people. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly how have done my work. You know, my work, for the most part, has been the work almost my entire career of making decisions that have a direct impact on people's lives. Yeah. There were only a few years, the 4 years I was in the U.S. Senate, that I was in a legislative body. But my career, for the most part, has not been one of being focused on giving lovely speeches or trying to pass a bill. It's been about making decisions that literally are about life and death, or about whether somebody maintains their liberty or not. Decisions that could move markets. As Attorney General of California, representing the fourth or fifth, depending on which year, largest economy in the world, being the chief law enforcement officer and the chief lawyer to protect consumer rights, my words could literally move markets. And so that's how I approach public policy. I'm probably oriented to think about, what does this actually mean, as opposed to how does this just sound?
When we come back, more from the vice president on the administration's record in office, the issues she's personally taken on, and her view on 2024. I began my conversation with Vice President Harris with questions about her upbringing in Oakland, her time as a prosecutor, and how it shapes her views as a politician. But the role of vice president isn't really about any of that. Mostly, vice presidents serve as a supporting act. And since Harris was selected as Biden's number 2, her main job has been to serve as his chief surrogate, particularly to communities that make up the Democrats' base. According to polling and our reporting throughout the year, Biden has struggled to win these groups over. And for some, the skepticism also extends to Harris, whose low approval ratings mirror the president's. While in office, the vice president has been tasked with several policy priorities, including expanding voting rights and overseeing efforts to address the root causes of migration from Central America. So I wanted to ask her about her work, her stance on a range of issues, and the stakes of next year's election. I saw it as an opportunity to get a preview of the administration's message in 2024. I also wanted to put directly to her concerns that others had only whispered about lacking enthusiasm among Black voters, young voters, and her own ability to energize the people that Democrats most need to win. In 2020, just as you're kind of ascending to the vice presidency, this racial justice movement breaks out in the country. And there is not necessarily the kind of smart on crime was not what we were hearing from a lot of kind of Democratic activists. It was something that was much more about upending systems. When you look back at that time, do you think kind of party activists went too far with messages like
going back to 2020.
messages like defund the police, or even, as you said at the time, reimagining policing altogether.
Well, I don't believe we should defund the police. Let's start there. And I do, however, maintain that we should, when we are thinking about where we're putting public resources, again, measure our productivity based on return on investment. Are we getting the best return on the investment of public dollars, taxpayer dollars, and do an assessment of where that money is best spent to get what we all want. When it comes to the criminal justice system, again, I will say, one of the main factors that should motivate policy there, I believe, is what is the best way to keep communities safe. And if we are thinking that way, then let's figure out what we are doing around things like prevention, because it's actually cheaper than reaction after it occurs.
Was that the message coming from the party, though, at that time? And if not, was that a mistake?
Well, the party, as you said earlier, is not a monolith. So there were a lot of different voices at that time.
Another thing in 2020 was obviously those things were happening at the time that Biden was making his selection for running mate. And I was reading stories at that time that was basically saying very clearly, the Times story, Harry Reid says that, he came to the decision that he needed to choose a black woman. While that is obviously about you, that's not necessarily you personally, but your identity. How should it matter? Does it matter that narrative has existed, that Biden needed to choose someone who was a black person? And should it matter?
I don't think I understand your question.
I'm saying, does it matter that kind of narrative around Biden needed to choose a black woman as a running mate still exists and has hovered over that selection? Or
it happened. I don't think I understand you. I honestly don't understand your question.
I'm saying, did that put
Has
you in
it lingered?
He
chose a black woman. That woman is me. So I don't know that anything lingers about what he should choose. He has chosen. He asked me to join him on the ticket.
I guess I can move on. I want to ask something more about the issues that are in your portfolio then. We've been focusing on root causes at the border. There's been more than $4 billion put into border policy, but that's not, when we think of 2024, it's much more short term.
Hold on, the $4 billion, are you referring to my initiative?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's not been put into the border. That has been put into root causes.
Yes, I'm saying, but when we think of the political issue of immigration, it's much more focused on short term. I'm saying, what is your answer to what has the administration done to short term secure border security and at the same time balance that with the priority of being open and welcoming to immigrants?
Okay, so let's start with the work that I've done. And the work that I've done has been to focus on the root cause issue. So not the border issue, but why is it that people are leaving, and to address those issues. And I come at that from the following perspective. Most people don't want to leave home. Most people do not want to leave home. They don't want to leave the place where they were raised. They don't want to leave their grandmother. They don't want to leave the church where they grew up in. They don't want to leave their community or their friends. And when they do leave, it usually is one of two things. They are fleeing harm, or they simply cannot satisfy the basic needs of themselves or their family if they stay. So my work addressing root causes has been informed by that perspective. And so the work I have done is to create and to work on a public-private partnership where I have been working with the private sector to invest resources in particular, the three main countries that are in the northern part of Central America to address the root causes. And we have raised over $4.2 billion dealing with issues like what we can do to support agriculture, which is a main facet of the economy of a lot of these countries, what we can do to support getting people into the financial system online, because that is a way that, getting into the detail of it, because that's important, by working with, for example, MasterCard and others, what we've been doing is getting people into online banking so the gangs cannot take their cash, and that they are actually a bit more protected in their ability to earn and keep a living going. So that's the work we have been doing. As it relates to border, our administration has been very clear. We need a safe, secure, and humane system of immigration. The bottom line is we need Congress to act. Congress must pass immigration reform. It is irresponsible that we have over 10 million people in the country, some of whom have been here for decades, who are living a life where they are productive and they are paying taxes. And there's no movement from Congress. It's a shame that it has become so partisan. There was a time when President Bush was advocating for it, when John McCain was advocating for it, and now we're in a place where the rhetoric around it has been to vilify and attempt to dehumanize immigrants.
Yeah. I get the roadblocks in Congress, and I get your kind of root cause work in the long term. I'm saying if you're a voter in the short term who is saying, is our border secure, and what is this administration's answer to that? What's that answer?
The answer is that we are absolutely making it secure and putting resources into it to do that work.
Mm-hmm. Another thing you've been focused on is voting rights. And President Biden made really explicit promises to black communities as he, rose to the nomination on voting rights, on criminal justice reform, two things that have not been able to come to fruition. When we ask about kind of promises made, promises kept to black communities, it's often pointed to individuals in high places, representation. I'm asking, has that promise made to black communities been kept?
So in the 2.5 years that we have been in office, I am proud that we have achieved a number of accomplishments that have benefited all people in America and have benefited black Americans in particular. Mm-hmm. As a proud graduate of an HBCU, the fact that we have invested, I think, almost $6 billion in our HBCUs is an extraordinary it will have extraordinary impact given that our HBCUs are centers of academic excellence. Mm-hmm. The work that we have done, for example, that I've been doing on increasing access to capital, a lot of that has benefited and been focused on black small businesses and Latino small businesses and Native small businesses and rural small businesses. The work that we have done bringing down the cost of insulin and capping it at $35 a month, black Americans are 60% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes than others. And when I meet with our seniors who have told stories of trying to decide whether they literally put food in their refrigerator or be able to afford a prescription a doctor has given them to save their life, and having to make that difficult choice because they can't do both. Us capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month is very significant for a lot of people. Latinos are 70% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes. When you look at the work that we have done that has been about addressing what we need to do around police reform, and banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants for federal law enforcement. Yeah. There is that work. There is the work that we have done in saying that we are going to make sure that we increase by 50% the number of federal contracts that go to minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, and what that will mean for addressing some of these issues. The work that we are doing around housing and affordable housing. Secretary Marcia Fudge has been extraordinary in terms of the policies and the resources that we are putting into addressing the inequities that have long existed in terms of access to home ownership. We are addressing, for example, the fact that the data has long told us that black homeowners get appraised at lower levels for their home, which means they're getting less money when they try to sell it than other homeowners. And we are taking that issue on in a substantial way, including talking about the issue, training, and making sure that there's going to be some accountability for that unfairness that has resulted in severe economic inequities. So these are just some examples of the work that we have done, not to mention the work that we are doing that is about pushing for student loan debt relief. We're not giving up on that. We're acutely aware that when you look, for example, at our policy about giving even greater student loan debt relief for Pell Grant recipients, knowing that the majority of black students, I believe, are Pell Grant recipients, this work is all very intentional to address long-standing inequities that can be addressed in a way that everyone benefits.
Yeah. What's the disconnect then between that and translating to more black votes? Why isn't that happening?
Why don't you talk to me after 2024?
Okay. We mentioned up there that the kind of gun safety legislation can feel like a drop in the bucket. And that comes up with voters that we talk to all the time, that while they recognize the administration's accomplishments, there's real structural barriers for getting kind of big things passed. When you look,
you can call it structural barrier. I call it the United States Congress.
Mm-hmm. When we look ahead to a second term, what is the message to voters who still see you all running up against those barriers over and over?
Vote.gov. People need to vote. People need to vote in their numbers, and they are voting, and they will vote. In 2020, we saw record turnout. I cannot underemphasize the magnificence of the American people, that during the height of a crisis, a pandemic, when there was an extraordinary loss of life, people lost their jobs, loss of normalcy, we had some of the highest turnout of voting in any presidential cycle. Young voters, historic turnout. And it's because people understood the connection between their vote and the policies like those we have been able to pass. We haven't even begun to discuss what we have done on one of the biggest crises, front page of your newspaper and everywhere else, which is the climate crisis. Our administration has been able to get through, often without bipartisan support, what I estimate to be probably $1 trillion that we are investing in climate resilience and adaptation, in clean energy, a new economy, job training, jobs. We have brought back we have created 800,000 new manufacturing jobs in the United States. This is the work that we have done, and it's because people voted. And what we will be doing between now and November of 2024 is thanking them because they went out there and they said, this is what we want of our government and for our future. And they told us what they want, and it is on that basis, with that blueprint, that we are rolling out the accomplishments that I am very proud of.
When we think about something, though, take example abortion rights. We had that big vote in Ohio this week, right? You have people coming out and really affirming what we have seen being a consistent driver towards Democrats. But that's mostly been stopping Republicans from implementing more restrictions on abortion, more than there's been the ability to expand abortion rights. How do you respond to the thing that we hear consistently from voters that often feels like the Democratic Party is day late or dollar short on kind of expanding abortion rights rather than just blocking Republican attempts, playing too much defense rather than actually what's the plan to expand abortion rights? Do you get what I'm saying?
I'm not sure, because I look at the midterms from Kansas to California, and the voters voted in favor of maintaining
you see a
the
Democratic Party
freedom
that is on
and
offense.
rights of women to make decisions about their own body. I look at Ohio, I look at Wisconsin and what happened in terms of that election for their Supreme Court, which was historic and is going to have a very direct impact on this issue. I look at the organizing that is happening right here with 2,000 folks who are from, communities around the country. I think a lot of them are Democrats who are standing up and organizing on this issue. So I think that there is a lot of reason to be optimistic and to understand that it is the history of our country that there is very little that we have achieved by way of progress without a fight, without organizing, without people understanding the importance of standing up and speaking out in support of America realizing her promise. And I'm seeing that happen around our country. And I feel very optimistic because I also understand that the people know what we're up against in terms of these full-on, intentional attempts to destroy our democracy. And when I travel around the country, I've been to almost as many red states as I have blue. And I will tell you, people are organizing and they're not having it. They're not going to have these extremist so-called leaders who are attempting to destroy and weaken our democracy. And I am incredibly inspired by what I'm seeing out there, knowing that we got a lot of work to do, and that our country is worth it.
In 2020, the Biden message was really centered around that idea that there was kind of an emergency that needed to be stopped and kind of pointing toward Donald Trump.
Well, as the president said, he made the decision to run because he believed that the soul of America was very much at stake.
Is that the message for 2024 too? Is it Soul of America Part 2?
I don't know that we want to. Here's what I would say. What is at stake in 2024 is our democracy. Our democracy is on the line. And And we are looking at a moment where we could go one of two ways. And one is to stand up in support of and defend our democracy and fundamental principles upon which we were found, such as freedom. And there is that track, or there is a track that is about an attempt to destroy all that has made us strong over the years in terms of the importance of rule of law and democratic institutions.
My last question is, when we talk to Democrats about when they look ahead to 2024, they express confidence in the administration's kind of political achievements, but some have pointed to lagging poll numbers or lack of favorability from both the President Biden and to you and the numbers we see. What is your response to the idea that we see in some data that the favorability question around you, and that when you look and say what Vice President Kamala Harris brings to the ticket, what is that clear answer?
Were you in this room of 2,000 people?
Mm-hmm.
Did you see them cheering and standing?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I say. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
That's the run-up for Thursday, November 16th, 2023. And now, the rundown.
I am suspending my campaign. I think the voters who are the most remarkable people on the planet have been really clear that they're telling me, not now, Tim.
On Sunday, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina announced in an interview with Fox News that he was dropping out of the Republican primary.
I don't think they're saying, Trey, no, but I do think they're saying not now.
He left the door open for a future run.
I think what our country is going through right now is a very challenging time, and our goal should be to unite this country and not take advantage of the divisions of this country.
And he ended his campaign with what's become a signature.
The more time we spend talking about having faith in God, faith in each other, and faith in our future, the better off we will be as Americans, and the more likely we are to come back together to be that one nation under God.
A message of faith. There are now 8 candidates left in the race for the Republican nomination. And for my profile of Kamala Harris, I spoke to more than 75 people over the course of 8 months. If you would like to read the full magazine story, which ran on the cover of the October 22nd issue, it's titled, In Search of Kamala Harris, and it's linked in the description for this episode. We're 8 weeks and 4 days out from the Iowa caucuses, and 355 days till the general election. We'll see you next week. The Run-Up is reported by me, Astead Herndon, and produced by Elisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, and Elishaba Itu. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Caitlin Love. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Haufinger, Renan Borelli, Jeffrey Miranda, Mahima Chablani, and Maddie Masiello. If you like the show and want to get updates on the latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, y'all.